Today, I'll be talking about Darwinism, and evolution. Now, there are three different terms there. Darwinism is something that was coined after Darwin, but it's not what the sort of evolution that we are aware of today. And Darwin wasn't the first one to talk about evolution. Evolution was there before Darwin, but Darwin managed to formulate a theory that was the best explanation at the time. Now, what we have as evolutionary theory today is a long way from what Darwin suggested, but anyway, that's why the title refers to three terms there, because they're not synonymous. Now, when we want to talk about Darwin, at Darwin's times, we want to emphasize first what sort of mysteries, what was the backdrop for Darwin. When Darwin came around, he had some questions. Many people had questions at that time, and he actually was thinking of answers, and in some ways he dared to answer them. So the 19th century mysteries at the time of Darwin were things such as fossils, which were actually increasing in volume. There's so many fossils appearing, and fossils of all sorts, and fossils that actually showed organisms that have nothing similar to them or nothing equivalent to them at the time when they were discovered. So there were various explanations that people put at that time. There were jokes of nature. There were tests of faith or false signs by Satan to really take us away from faith. And there were, in some mythical stories, there were just remains of mythical dragons that were actually normally killed by some saints or whatever. And their monsters turned into stone by some supernatural power. But there was the rational explanation that these were actually creatures that existed before, and they went extinct. Now, the question of extinction is a problem, as we will see later, for many theologians at that time. To think about that anything that God created could go extinct was really a big way off. Now, the other mystery that naturalists were dealing with was things such as, why is there so much variation? Why was there so much diversity in organisms? You might actually find so many different species, and at that time they didn't know as many as we know today, but they still thought that there were just too many species there, and there was a lot of variation that might exist within any species. And so what could explain this variation in the same kind? The other mystery that people were debating were things such as the fact that species, are they fixed? They don't change, or do they actually change? Because if they change, then we might link them to fossils or whatever. So, now these mysteries, or these questions, if you like, were posed by many naturalists before Darwin and at the time of Darwin. Now, Darwin comes into the scene 1809, where after 20 years, when he was a young adult, he was actually trying to find a way in his career. And in 1825, he joined the medical school at Edinburgh University, where he later dropped out, and historians argue about the reasons, but there are a number of reasons why he might have quit. Then he transferred to theology at Cambridge University. And there, ironically, he was supposed to become a minister in the Church of England. Now, the fact that he was a mediocre student didn't prevent him from really posing big questions. And he actually befriended many of the naturalists in those universities. His friends were naturalists, and that's where his interest was. Now, his father, who was a doctor, didn't like this. And so he wrote him once saying, "You care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, and you will be disgraced to yourself and your family," because that was a big disappointment for the father. But one day, he got this opportunity to go on a voyage on a Beagle. He had managed to ship the Beagle, and that was a 5-year journey from 1831 to 1836. Now, he went straight from England to the Amazonian forest, which was actually a huge, shocking change. And there he was able to collect huge collections of all sorts of organisms, birds, insects, spiders, and plants. Then he, during the journey in the tip of South America, he was actually impressed with these Indians, so-called Indians there, whose survival was really something that would put a lot of questions about their ability to survive in such a very hostile environment. So he's actually impressed with their ability to adapt. And in Chile, he witnessed an earthquake. And the earthquake, as we know today, happened quite a lot in Chile. But he was actually able to witness the fact that the level of the land was raised 2 meters, just in one earthquake. So he's actually impressed with the way that nature could display its dramatic changes. Now, it's worth pointing out at this stage that Darwin there was nothing like a biologist or a geologist. People were naturalists at that time. People were interested in these. And so he was a naturalist, and he was actually more interested in geology at that time. But then, obviously, his interest, he turned into biology when he visited the Galapagos Islands. In the Galapagos Islands, he was able to see some really amazing experience of all sorts of organisms there that didn't exist anywhere else. Just in this middle of the ocean, you have this group of islands, and they contained such a variety. They were uninhabited, they were volcanic islands, and he was able to see a very unusual collection of animals and plants. The animals obviously were particularly interesting, and he was actually raising questions, and at that point, we have to remember that Darwin was still a very young guy, and in his 20s. But he thought to himself that he was brought within reach of that great fact, that mystery of mysteries. What that mystery of mysteries he meant was the origin of creatures, or as he later put it in his book, the origin of species. How would species come about? Now, after coming back to England, he published a number of monographs, papers, and books, and they were mostly concerned with a variety of things, but the question of evolution wasn't being discussed publicly. He was actually discussing some theories with his close friends. And it went on like this until one day there was another naturalist in the Far East, Alfred Russel Wallace, who wrote him a letter. Actually, he wrote a paper, and he sent it to Darwin, and he wanted Darwin's opinion on some of the ideas there. And when he read the paper, he realized with his friends that what Wallace was proposing was something similar to his own ideas. And so they had to rush and make presentations in the Linnaean Society conference there, where he proposed the concept of natural selection. Now, what is natural selection? I will come to later. But one has to always be fair and say that it wasn't only Darwin. It was Darwin and Wallace who proposed the idea of natural selection. But then he realized that he had so much to say, and he published his first book on the subject, the famous Origin of Species, obviously with a longer title, By Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, in the whole book, he never mentioned the word evolution. And the word he used was more like descent with modification, because the term he used, he wanted to express what the term really meant in practice, and so what he was talking about, descent of species with modifications from generation to generation. And eventually, in the 6th edition, he couldn't avoid using the word evolution. He actually used the word evolved in the 1st edition in the last paragraph of the book, but the word evolution now became the term to describe the process of change in species. Now, what we refer to as being Darwinism is not purely Darwinism, apart from Wallace, who proposed the idea of natural selection. But before that, the 4 concepts there, 3 of them were there debated before Darwin. One of them is the fact that species change, the non-constancy of species. And so there was variation, there was changeability, they were being accepted that they happen. The fact that the change could occur gradually, not in big jumps, and the fact that branching occurs between species in the same way that in humans you have families branching into other families and so on. And then what was purely Darwinian and Wallace is the mechanism of evolution that he suggested. So let's start first with the non-constancy of species. That's not original because a long time ago it was mentioned in the works of Anaximander and Lucretius, and something like all living things were related and they had changed over time. The idea was there a long time ago. Now in Muslim scholars you could actually find these ideas there, but obviously that is not relevant to Darwin because I don't think Darwin knew much about it. But now, looking into the old literature, one would find that there, some by Al-Jahiz and Nakhshabi, Nasir-Din Tusi, there was this concept of the struggle for existence and the species changing into other species. Now, in the early 19th century, before Darwin, Lamarck talked about change in species or transmutation of species, and we will come back to Lamarck later on. Now, the question of, or the other concept of gradualism was proposed, and it actually it was a departure from the general ideas at that time, because what people thought about at that time when they saw fossils and found in the sediments and the rocks and so on, they suggested that maybe every now and then on Earth there were some catastrophic events, what we know as catastrophism. Now, the extinctions, according to them, were caused by successive extinctions, successive events, catastrophes. And the Earth, because of this, experienced a number of catastrophes, and so if you give each period a bit of time, then it will count up to something like 70,000 years. Now, for them to say that the Earth was 70,000 years was really a big thing there, because before that, the Christian theology was suggesting that the Earth existed, was created something like 4,000 years before Christ, going by the chronology that they find in the Bible. Now, the creationists at that time suggested that maybe, well, if you're going to suggest that there's some extinction there, then there must have been, the latest one that we live in must have been the latest creation. So there are maybe 50 to 100 creations, and then followed by extinctions, and then the latest one is the one that we're in today. Now, this idea of catastrophism was actually demolished by, not by Darwin, by people other than Darwin. Actually, it was by geologists, Hutton in the 18th century and Lyell in the 19th century. Lyell was a contemporary of Darwin, and he was one of his friends. Now, in his voyage on the Beagle, he had this book on the principles of geology, and he read it thoroughly, and he adopted this concept of what we call uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism simply suggests that there is a gradual change. Now, I'll come to the gradual bit in a minute, but the idea that catastrophes happen to really eventually illustrate or to manifest themselves in the geological forms that we have. What uniformitarianism in geology was suggesting that we don't have to really look for some really huge, catastrophic, dramatic events. All you have to do to understand what was happening millions of years ago, we had just to look at what's happening today. So the same events that we see today are the same events were happening in the past. But over a period of time, small little events might actually eventually translate into big dramatic changes. And so some forces in the present and the past, the same forces are there. And in the past, nothing, well, of course, we see catastrophes even today. So when that happens, it's not much different from what happened in the past. So let's give an example on this. Now, if you look at some rocks today, any sort of rocks, then you will find that there might be some strata like in the sedimentary rock. But when you think about their origin, they didn't just happen in a flash or in one catastrophe. They might have happened by small events such as erosion and deposition. We all scream every winter about the flooding that occurs in Beirut and the sediments that are left there. If nothing is done about this, then the streets will be full of sediments year after year. You know, cities disappear over a period of a couple of thousand years just by being buried by sediments. Now, if you have sediments brought in by floods, by rivers, and so on, then they eventually accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. You don't have to have maybe except like 1 millimeter of sediments every year. Over 1,000 years, that will make 1,000 millimeters. Now, sometimes there might actually be dust storms that bring dust from one place to another. And then, in order to get to that form, it will have taken millions of years. And that's really the important aspect about what Darwin really extracted from the idea of uniformitarianism. In order for things like this to happen, they need a very long time. And he suggested if there's any change in the species, then that means it will have to take a very long time. Actually, people might say, like, Darwin needed that idea to try to explain how changes could occur in species that might seem dramatic, but they have taken such a long time to occur. Now, let's take something closer to home. If you ever go to Jaita, you'll find these structures. Now, these structures happen, you can see them forming. But obviously, you don't see them forming in a dramatic way that you might think. These are formed by drop after drop after drop for thousands of years. And so these structures might have taken maybe 1 meter of this might have taken something like 8,000 or 9,000 years. This is the idea of uniformitarianism. Shapes, forms, geological formations, and so on, all of them might have taken very, very long time before we see them the way they are today. So the implication really for uniformitarianism is that the process of anything forming is a very gradual process. And that means it has taken a long time. And that will imply really that the Earth is really very, very old. Nothing like 70,000 years, because at that time they thought that was too long. Actually, it was millions of years. By the time Darwin died, he didn't know that the Earth is 4.56 billion years. They were still talking about maybe tens or hundreds of millions, but not thousands of millions of years that we know today. Now, the first one to incorporate the idea of uniformitarianism was Lamarck. Now, unfortunately for Lamarck, he's always remembered for the wrong things. But this is one of the good things that he actually got into the process of biological evolution. And he termed this transmutation of species, saying that uniformitarianism means that there's a gradual change in species over time. That means between one generation and the next generation, it doesn't have to be really a dramatic change. A very tiny change, and I will come to this later when I talk about Darwinism. Now, the idea of branching was also a departure from what was known at that time, because at that time what the Christian theology adopted in Europe was some version of Aristotle's linear scale of nature. That scale of nature classifies organisms into lower and higher, or one before and after, or whatever. Now here they're talking about imperfect and perfect. Just he classified them in a way that the least perfect are at the bottom and the most perfect are there. And then obviously he would think that humans are the most perfect. Now Christian theology added to this that what is more perfect are the angels, archangels, and eventually, ultimately, God is the most perfect. So that linearity in the classification of organisms was demolished. Right? And what was introduced instead was the fact that all of these organisms that we have today, they have had their history of evolution, and they have branched along the way into various forms. And that actually is meaning something like that they are actually related, because that one doesn't imply any sort of relationship. Here, they imply relationship. Now, one thing has, you could see that what Darwin there was scribbling relationship between organisms. This statement is a very important statement there. The only cause of similarity, that's what Darwin said. The only cause of similarity in individuals we know of is relationship. Saying that if you and your brother or sister, whatever, you look similar because you're related. If you look similar to your own cousins and so on, because you're related. if we all in a community look in a way similar because we are related. And in that same sense that organisms, when they're similar, it's not just simply they're similar, they are related. And when say related, that means they have common ancestry. And that actually is a very important concept there. Now, the mechanism of evolution that Darwin suggested of being natural selection, Darwin and Wallace. Now, this is a particularly Darwinian idea there. And what was influenced by, not naturalists, it was influenced by Thomas Malthus, who was actually an economist. He wrote an essay on the principle of population, and what Malthus was suggesting by studying human populations, that over time, population will increase geometrically or exponentially in some cases, which was basically graphically will look something similar, and the resources increase linearly. And that means at some point the population will exceed the resources, and that when you have the conflict that might actually occur. Point of crisis, where the population, there are too many people to feed and the resources become limited. And this eventually will lead to various problems, including food shortages, famine, disease, war, etc. Now, this was particularly about human population, but Darwin adopted this for all populations of all sorts of species. Now, the idea of natural selection also was influenced by another mechanism of selection that people were practicing. That's what we call artificial selection. Artificial selection has been practiced by human societies for thousands of years, which brings to the origin of the dog, for example. Dogs were some wolf-like species that eventually were bred to become first more friendly and more likely to bond with people. And then we had all sorts of breeds that, for various purposes that were made. Eventually, we know that these breeds are not the only ones. When you look at how many breeds we do actually have quite a lot of breeds. And all of these breeds have common genetic basis. From the genome, the genes that a dog has, you can actually produce all sorts of forms that come by natural selection. And natural selection, by artificial selection. Artificial selection is practiced in a way that if you actually desire a certain characteristic, then you breed the individual with that characteristic. If you want very small dogs, then you breed the smallest ones, and then you remove the ones that are not that small, and so on. And then you look at all these characteristics there. They were actually purposefully selected by humans. Now, not only this, we know that humans have selected all sorts of things like chicken, like pigeons. Actually, Darwin looked at this question. He looked at chicken and pigeon selection. And he was able to see that within a very short period, by actually selecting the individuals to breed, one would be able to produce artificially certain characteristics that might be equivalent to something that we might call adaptation. Now, artificial selection is practiced for all sorts of things, plants and animals, and we know that some of the staple foods that we have actually were selected by humans. Corn, wheat, and so on. All of them were selected to eventually produce populations with desirable characteristics. Now, when we look at the difference between what Darwin suggested and Lamarck, first, both of them didn't have an idea about inheritance. They didn't know how inheritance occurred. At that time, they didn't know things like mutation. They didn't know how, for example, what is the mechanism by which characteristics from parents could be transferred to the offspring. Now, Lamarck had some ideas there about what evolution is. He actually thought of it as being a directed process, or in a way, that eventually evolution will lead to more perfection. And that's something we know today doesn't happen, because evolution might lead to all sorts of forms that might actually be better than the other ones before them, but there's no perfection involved. Now, he suggested also that species do not go extinct. They just change into something else, which is also not true. In some cases, they do go extinct, and in some ways, they go and become different species. And the worst idea that Lamarck suggested, which was actually what would ruin his reputation, and the one that we remember Lamarck for, is the idea that characteristics could be inherited by offspring, but the characteristics that are inherited could be acquired by their parents. Like something like if you go and spend some time in the sun and you get a suntan, then the offspring will have some tan. If you become muscular, then children become muscular, which is obviously something that was ridiculous. But the characteristic would develop in that way, by use and disuse, as he suggested. But Darwin wasn't much different from this idea in a way, but I will show you the difference there between Darwin. But the idea of what Lamarck is suggesting was very similar to Darwin in the sense that the change that occur could be minute changes, very tiny changes between one generation and the next. So if you look at the question of how the giraffe got its neck by evolution, the Lamarckian idea would be that if you actually have a need for a giraffe to be able to pick up more food at higher heights, then it will have to stretch its leg a bit. And then eventually it might actually stretch a bit. And the offspring that each giraffe will have a slightly longer neck, slightly, tiny change in the neck. But over a period of time, many generations, then eventually all the giraffes will have long necks. And that is the big difference between Darwin and, because according to Darwin, or according to what we know today, but natural selection will go like this. It isn't that all the individuals actually do have this need to stretch their neck and eventually transfer this to the next generation. What Darwin suggests that there is variation. Within any population, we have variation. Now, he didn't know where this variation comes from. We know today the word mutation refers to these changes that might occur, that will produce different genes by these mutations. And so they will produce these different forms. And now, what Darwin was suggesting, apart from his lack of knowledge of this, that over a period of time, there would be, well, amongst any population, some giraffes that might have a slightly longer neck than others, very slightly longer necks. And then that they will have a better chance of surviving. And that means they will have slightly more offspring. And so over many generations, this will not show in the next generation. It will take, for example, like 25 generations, so they will double in number. Over maybe 75 generations or even longer, then eventually those ones that have longer necks will eventually dominate the population, because the ones that do not have long necks, they will not survive very well. And so the ones that dominate them. This is what we call natural selection. Natural selection favors the ones that have a certain characteristic that is suitable for the environment, and it will not favor the ones that do not have this characteristic. And that's why the giraffe eventually will get this long neck. Now, this might actually apply to any characteristic. And so these are the main postulates of Darwin. After Darwin, after the origin of species, not after Darwin, Darwin wasn't in good health really for a long period of his life, and he would shy away from going out. And so there were people who were actually going there and defending his theory. One of them was Thomas Huxley. Now, he was called his bulldog, because he's the one that was go barking around in all these meetings. And anyway, now, one thing that he said, that the idea of natural selection is so simple. And that's why he thinks that he must have been very stupid not to have thought of it. Many people thought of this anyway, that it would be stupid not to think of it. So Darwin came up with a simple idea, but it made a lot of difference. But also, remember, why Darwin, not Wallace? Because Darwin wrote a lot of things later with so much evidence that he produced. He had so much material that he could use for that purpose. And eventually, we know evolution as a Darwinian idea. Now, Darwin didn't go into human evolution very much, but Huxley ventured into this. So he published Man's Place in Nature, and he actually referred to the anatomies that are similar between the apes and humans. He coined a couple of interesting words. One of them is Darwinism. Darwinism, and he coined the word agnostic. Now, the other term for this is what people sometimes refer to as being atheism. Now, Darwin and Huxley didn't want to commit themselves to being atheistic, so they're agnostic. Agnostic meaning, I don't know, maybe, maybe not, it's not relevant, whatever. It's not a question that could make a lot of difference. So, agnosticism, in a way, is not accepting the theology of that time, but at the same time not committing to complete denial of the existence of God. It might be true or might not be true, and that's something that could be dealt with by other people. Anyway, so after Origin of Species, he published a number of books. He actually went into the question of human behavior, and so he looked at descent of man and selection in relation to sex. And so he talked about sexual selection and the expression of emotion in man and animals. I will see a couple of examples later. So now, I mentioned earlier that one of the problems with Darwin is that he didn't know how inheritance occurs. Lamarck didn't. And so that remained a big gap, because you couldn't answer many of the questions that people were putting about how characteristics are transferred. Until someone in 1900 discovered the work of Gregor Mendel, which is, curiously, he read Darwin, and Darwin might have been aware of his work because he was a contemporary, but they never connected. But in the 1900s, someone looked at this, and so we owe the development of genetics to this monk who was actually conducting the experiments on the garden peas, and he came up with a lot of theories that we refer to today being Mendelian genetics, and eventually that happens to be the most important contribution. Actually, it filled the gap. It would provide the material for answering questions that Darwin couldn't answer. And so after this, many biologists, many brains came around and actually came together, and they incorporated inheritance, genetics into evolution. And so what we have today is what we call the new synthesis of evolution theory, or sometimes referred to as neo-Darwinism. Darwinism with the increased knowledge there in terms of inheritance. Right, so there was a theory proposed by evolution by Darwin, and there were a lot of people who were defending it. So what does this theory explain? That's what theories are meant to do, to explain things. So first, they would explain what fossils are. Now, when people look at fossils, then we will find that one could actually make a record of the changes in species being in different layers in the soil. And so we could explain fossils as the fact that they belong to species that went extinct, or they were ancestors for species that came after them. And you can see the timeline there by the layers. Now, if one could have more records, then you could actually build a fuller story. Like, for example, the story of the horse. The horse started as a tiny organism, and then over time it evolved into the horse that we know today. Now, not all species enjoy this detail because there is still a lot to be found, and gaps that occur not necessarily because the story is not right, it's because we don't have enough material. It's like looking at a series and missing a few episodes, and then you come and you find things have changed, and so by missing a few episodes you cannot tell what happened later. But if you have all the episodes there, then you can construct a whole story. Now, one of the problems that people have with evolution is try to come to terms with the idea that two species that are so different might actually have a relationship, like one to be the ancestor of another one. For example, this one is related to this one. Now, it evolved from this one, if you like. But then, if you actually look at this and just say, well, how could this happen? Now, it will make more sense if you look at all the intermediates that occur between them. So between this one and this one, there were so many intermediates that then you could actually see the steps there that lead from one species to the other species, and that's the thing that you have for all sorts of species. Now, another explanation is for the biogeography of organisms. Biogeography of organisms refers to how we relate the species to their geography. If you actually look at some species of all sorts, like, for example, this fish species, the fish species there are very similar. And if you look at their similarity, the similarity corresponds to the geographic distances. The ones that are more distant geographically tend to be more different. The ones that are closer geographically tend to be more similar. And that means, like for example, in any rural area, you find that there are some related families that if you look back, you could actually connect them. And the more related families happen to live in neighboring villages, the ones that are not so related will be living in other villages or more distant villages. The same thing you can find for all sorts of species, like in this case, the butterflies. Now this is what we call biogeography. Comparative anatomy looks at the similarities between organisms that might not seem to be so similar, but if you look at their structures, the anatomies, for example here, the ones with the same colors are the homologous structures. And in the various animals that you find there, from humans to birds, you find that the basic structure is there, except that some of the forms have changed over time as an adaptation to their existence. There's something that we call vestigial structures. Like organisms, as they evolve, some structures are there and they don't become subject to selection that much, and so they remain there. For example, the origin of the whale, it's a mammal, and its origin is in a land mammal that became marine. And so we can see that some of the vestiges of that ancestry is found there in some of the bones that correspond to the legs, the hind legs. If you look at some snakes, for example, snakes are limbless, but you might see in some snakes the remnants of limbs that had existed before, and they lost them over a period of time. This lizard from Lebanon the poor thing is always mistaken for a snake. It's not a snake, actually, it's a lizard. And you can still see small legs there, which is the vestigial organ there. Now, humans have plenty of vestigial structures there. Muscles in the ear, they're there. They're meant to move the ear, but they're not working anymore. You find, for example, the fact that you have the wisdom tooth that is there because of the fact that we had our ancestors having a tooth there that will only give us problems, and so eventually we end up removing it. The hair, which doesn't have any function as much today as it was in our ancestors who had hair to provide insulation. Now we don't have it, but it's still there. And we have the appendix, for example, that will only give us problems, and eventually sometimes some people might actually have to remove it. There is something called Darwin's tubercle there, Darwin's point, and the point is a remnant of the pointed ears that some of our ancestors have. Now it doesn't exist in all people. You could test maybe, right? But if you don't have it, it doesn't mean that you haven't evolved from an ape. Now, embryos, as you go back in the development process, you find out as you get earlier and earlier, then animals tend to be more and more similar. Except during development, then when they become fetuses and then they become, they're born and become adults, they change. But if you want to go even earlier, all animals have sperms and eggs. And that's the production happens in the same way in all of them. Now, if you look at what we know today on the molecular level, we know that all organisms have some basic molecules. Nucleotides, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, DNA, RNA. DNA is the same all over the animal kingdom and plant kingdom. It's the same DNA, the same structure. And it works in the same way by producing proteins, using RNA, and so on. And we know that today they just take one gene from one organism and put it in the other, and then you might actually have it to function to produce certain substance or whatever. And so that indicates that the basic structure there, the basic machine that works, it works in the same way. Now, adaptations that occur in various sort of animals, like these birds, these mammals here, they become adaptation to the environment. The environment eventually leads to these adaptations. The ones that are more adapted are more likely to survive. And so that means the more adapted ones are the ones that you find surviving today. And all the ones that were not adapted have gone extinct. And so that's also another evidence for evolution. Now, some people always say that, well, do you actually see evolution of one species into other species? Of course, maybe you will not see this happening because it takes a very long time. It will not happen in your lifetime. It will not happen in many generations. But we see evolution happening. For example, we know that bacteria eventually become resistant to some drugs. How could that happen? It was natural selection. The bacteria that survive when an antibiotic is applied are the ones that eventually produce more and more of these resistant bacteria. And that's why in many hospitals you find that the bacteria there tend to be resistant because natural selection eventually led to some population of bacteria that are resistant. You find the same thing in some insects by applying pesticide all the time, and that's one of the non-advisable things, to apply all of these in such in an abusive manner, that eventually you end up with insects that are resistant to the pesticide. Many pollutants sometimes also lead to evolution of some organisms, some plants, whatever. They actually become more and more resistant. We can see evolution happening. Whether they eventually become a new species, that will take longer, but we can see populations changing over time. Now, one of the concepts that eventually is implied by Darwinism is that these things are there without a designer. Nature designs them in a way. Natural selection, adaptation, the need to survive, and so on. They actually are the designing forces. So here, Ayala in 2007 talked about the concept of design without a designer. Now, it says that what actually drives the changes are the natural laws of physics that eventually will lead to changes that might occur. Now, what analogous thing we have today of this is the evolution of languages. Nobody could say that anybody invented languages. And if you look at the languages as they exist today, they might actually be like species. And we might be able to relate them. And there might actually be also biogeography involved. Like geographically related languages tend to be the most similar ones. They actually, like for example here, you talk about European languages, right? Then you have all sorts of languages that evolve there. Look at any other language, you'll find that. Now, a bigger picture there of all sorts of languages in the world, you will find that languages are related in a way similar to the way that these fish are related. The ones that are closer geographically will happen to be more similar than the ones that are distant. Now, obviously, hostility to Darwin would be something that will start then and it will continue until today. The main problem that many people might not accept, really, okay, a worm evolved into another worm, fine. But humans could not have evolved from something like apes. And so obviously these cartoons were depicted there, depicting Darwin as an ape. And because of the story or the idea of human evolution. Now, we have to remember that at the time of Darwin, there was very little knowledge about human evolution. The only non-Homo sapien that existed at that time was the Neanderthal man in Europe. There were fossils of this Neanderthal man, but since then, well, what Darwin suggested really, that one day light will be thrown on the origin of man and that's exactly what happened. Because now, almost 200 years later, we see thousands of fossils indicating a human relationship there. So we have some tree that's constructed for that purpose. Now, here, new discoveries are made all the time. For example, this one in South Africa a couple of years ago. Now, also, a Chinese fossil were discovered that will really change a bit the scenario, but the story remains that there is a lot of evidence to show that humans have evolved from apes. Now, we see evolution behavior that could be connected to DNA. This tree connects various bee species by DNA relationship. And then we see that this also has a parallel relationship there in terms of different sort of behavior. Now, human behavior, one would need to understand human behavior very well. You need to actually look at animal behavior. There's a lot of animal behavior that is there in human behavior. Like, for example, mate choices, how we choose mates, the social behavior. And it has a very good evolutionary explanation, and we could see this happening in various sort of species. Now, it is said that maybe humans had some mutation at some point that made them able to spread so much around the world, and that's why they cover most continents. Now, take body language, because before the word, there was body language. The word wasn't the first thing, actually. Now, the fact that we know what we know, we all respond to a nice smile, but we don't realize that the origin of the smile is something that's found in various sorts of primates. Showing teeth closed, because showing teeth open, that means that's a threat. But showing teeth closed, that means don't worry about me, I'm peaceful, I'm not, it's a sign of submission. And we can see a lot of smiling monkeys there. Right? Now, this one from illustration from Darwin's book, one of Darwin's books, this baboon, as you can see, he's enjoying the fact that he's being scratched in his back. He scratches his back, and then next thing he shows that he's really enjoying it. Right. Now, when you look at the way that we look at apes as being other animals, it's amazing to see the distinctions falling between us and the apes. For example, this famous Coco gorilla was brought up in a home, and it actually was taught sign language. And the amazing expressions it has about emotions, about love, about needing something, and also the way that it could understand and speak, and to have a personality, to have thoughts that could be actually translated something like this way: it wants to be hugged. Right? Right. The amazing thing that I discovered about chimpanzees in Japan not so long ago, recently, is the amazing memory they have. And no human could ever compete with their ability to remember a sequence of numbers. They showed them very quickly. And now, this is one sort of other species of chimp, the pygmy chimp, the bonobos. And the bonobos are amazing creatures. In this case, the language they're trying to teach them is lexicograms. They're symbols that they could press, and they could actually express themselves. They will understand sentences sometimes that... so, the ethics that people worry about when it comes to Darwinism, because say, if we're going to all behave like animals, then we're going to have a big mess in our human society. In fact, Darwinism suggested that ethics is a biological need. It was misinterpreted by people like Spencer, and they invented that's called social Darwinism, and they went on and started selecting. They started helping nature selecting, so they were selecting intelligent breeds, and then they wanted to eliminate handicapped and so on. That is actually what they made in the name of evolution, which is actually nothing to do with the idea of evolution. Because, in fact, the ethical behavior of humans has a biological origin. It has a biological need. And it's not only found in humans, it's found in a variety of animals, like chimpanzees and lions and ants, bees, and so on. So there's a social behavior there. There's a need. There's a biological need to be together and help each other. Now, the impact of evolutionary theory eventually would be that we have a new concept in biology. And so some people refer to it as being the organizing principle. Now, Dobzhansky, one of the people who pioneered in the 50s and 60s the construction of new Darwinism and so on, he suggests that nothing in biology would make sense except in the light of evolution. There's evolutionary biology, which is a whole branch in biology, and it emphasizes variability and changeability. And some people go further and say that no biologist has actually affected modern human zeitgeist, human thought, more than Charles Darwin. And one would not deny the impact that Darwin had. But obviously, there are a number of things that were before Darwin, like teleology and determinism. Now, even today, some people say that there's always some final cause that it will lead to. And so it emphasized the fact that there are a number of random processes. There's nothing that normally has any particular end. Now, the view of humanity that people, like I was just saying, that we could turn humanity into a group of animals and so on, actually, it emphasizes more the anthropocentrism that man is indeed unique. Now, obviously, the relationship with religion is another story, because the relationship with religion could sometimes stem from misunderstanding from the religious establishments. And so many religious establishments have accepted some ideas thereof. And it's possible that some people might not still accept it. And so there was, in the States, United States, they started with something called creation science. They turned eventually into something called intelligent design. And they talked about all this origin of all these evils that you have that had its origin in evolution. But here, even in Lebanon, we have this problem in the AUB, the Protestant college at that time. In 1882, Edwin Lewis was asked to make a speech, and he talked about Darwin in a very favorable manner. And so George Post wasn't happy with this, and so some faculty sided with Edwin, and eventually there were a number of faculty resignations, student prosecution suspensions, and so on. Now, evolutionary theory, nothing seriously challenged it. People a lot of the time throw criticism, but it's the model that nobody was able to challenge so far. And so there's no better explanation than the evolutionary theory I was talking about. Eventually, one has to go back to what Darwin's father said: you will be disgraced to yourself and all your family. Eventually, England accepted Darwin, and he was buried in Westminster Abbey along with the notables of Britain. Now, when you think about all these theories and how humans sometimes feel about it, now we should really see what monkeys feel about it as well. I don't think they like it the way that they have evolved to become us. Thank you very much.